Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is episode 83, and my guest today is Jade S. Sasser. Jade is a scholar of gender, climate change, and women's health. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of California, Riverside, where she also directs the major in sustainability studies. For more than a decade, Jade's work has focused on the intersections of global environmental problems and women's bodies and health in the context of international development. Her first book, On Fertile Ground, Population Control and Women's Rights in the Era of Climate Change, was published in 2018 by New York University Press. The book explores the history and current iterations of global population advocacy at the nexus of climate change and women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Jade is also hard at work on two new projects. The first draws on fieldwork in Madagascar and Vietnam and explores the distribution of improved cook stoves in the Global South as a win-win development intervention for gender equality, public health, and environmental benefits. Her second project is a partnership with the NAACP, and that analyzes the ways climate justice organizations in the U.S. incorporate gender justice into their work. In our interview, Jade and I discuss how the long racist and sexist histories of population control continue to shape current-day climate change debates and global health policy, how to approach scholarship from a position of social justice activism, bringing creative pursuits like photography into academic research, and why critiquing capitalist institutions instead of blaming marginalized individuals in debates over environmentalism is key to how Jade imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today, Jade.
Thank you for having me.
So you're the author of a really fantastically smart new book called On Fertile Ground, Population Control and Women's Rights in the Era of Climate Change. Can you give our listeners a little bit of sense of what that book covers and maybe what got you interested in that topic?
Yes. So the book is about the history and the current manifestations of population control narratives, ideas, and debates, specifically in the realm of environmentalism. And I got interested in that topic many years ago. I had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Madagascar. I was a health volunteer. And I noticed over time through talking to friends who worked in international development that the funding and the program priorities in Madagascar, which is an environmental hotspot country, the priorities and the funding for public health, specifically reproductive health, were in areas that were environmentally important in that country. And specifically contraceptive distribution, the provision of reproductive health services, they were concentrated in areas near parks, national parks, conservation areas, et cetera. And so I started to say, well, wait a minute, it sounds like reproductive health services are motivated by this environmental impulse. Why is that the case? And when I went back to graduate school after finishing Peace Corps several years later, I started reading books about global reproductive politics, the history of population control. I became fascinated by those subjects and did a deep dive. And I noticed that almost all of them in one way or another touched on environmental issues, but they never fully delved into them, at least not in a long-term historical sense. So I started to say, well, how has the environmental agenda actually shaped population control ideas? And I started studying that subject. It was the subject of my graduate dissertation, and then eventually it became this book.
What was some of the most exciting or maybe surprising things that you found over the course of that long process of doing research?
I think the most exciting thing is that there are a lot of people who are doing international work and they don't actually know the history or the source of the ideas, the narratives, the priorities behind what they're doing. So, for example, a key group that I study and talk about throughout this book is young people, youth activists. There are a lot of youth activists that are interested in global reproductive health and rights. They're interested in HIV prevention. They're interested in making sure that women have access to contraceptives. And they're also very interested in preventing, mitigating, and adapting to climate change. And so a lot of those young people are really raring to go. They want to get out there and do something and make a difference. And they put action first and reflection later. And I became really fascinated by what is motivating young people in particular to get active on population issues without having at all a sense of the history, the background, and the real problematic politics of what they're doing.
Have you found that when you teach these subjects, because I know you teach a lot of courses around the same topic, do you find that your students kind of have that mind blown moment where they're like, oh my God, I had no idea these things had this history?
Yes, that happens all the time. It happens every quarter. Every time we cover population issues, students are really taken aback because I go through specific examples of coercive human rights abuses that have been facilitated by a population control agenda. And I don't just talk about history, in sort of a distant way. I bring it up to the present. I talk about recent things that have happened. I talk about population control in the California prison system. A report that was generated discussing those issues in 2013 or 2014 documented that this still occurs today. There are still politicians as recently as 2008 that were calling for paying low-income people to become permanently sterilized in the service of, not having to feed, clothe, or house people in the wake of natural disasters caused by climate change. So these population control narratives, they are not a thing of the past. They are very much in the present, and my students are often shocked by that. But with that said, what also happens every quarter in the classroom, and it's intensely frustrating to me because I don't know what to do about this, is that students will hear me spend an entire hour and a half or even several weeks offering a very critical, very nuanced, very challenging perspective on population control. And then after all that, they'll still go back to, well, but we need to slow or control or end population growth because of climate change. Population is still something that we need to really tackle because of climate change. And I'm like, have you not listened to everything that I've been saying? And I understand what I'm doing in my work is I'm really trying to disrupt and dislodge paradigms, knowledge paradigms, and it's hard for young people to let those paradigms go because they've been raised with them. But I continue to persevere. I won't give up. I will continue to challenge my students' thinking and really try to disrupt and dislodge the idea that population control is a natural and necessary component for environmental conservation.
It sounds like a lot of the work you do both in the classroom and in your scholarship and in your other projects really weaves together your interest in academic research or scholarship with a commitment to social justice activism or social change and kind of creativity or thinking creatively about approaches to these. So I'd love to maybe shift a little to talk about that nexus, that braid of activism, academia, and art. What draws you to that kind of combination?
I think I've always thought about women's sexual and reproductive health and rights through an activist lens. And it was the activist lens that drew me to the academic research. So reproductive justice is an activist field. It's been around since the mid-1990s, led by women of color who have been resisting population control globally and here in the United States in particular. When I first read about the reproductive justice movement, I said, okay, this is exactly what I'm talking about. How can I weave this on-the-ground activism that these women have been doing for decades? How can I weave that into my academic work? So I started going to reproductive justice conferences, workshops, advocacy trainings. I started doing lobbying on the Hill, on Capitol Hill. I started getting to know the people in the reproductive justice movement and really understanding the narratives and frameworks that they're developing, and really positioning myself as a reproductive justice activist through scholarship. In terms of art, it's a bit interesting. I think of all of this writing as a creative process. I've been a writer, I would say, my entire life. I started off doing creative writing as a small child. I was writing poetry and short stories by the age of maybe 7 or 8. And even though this is academic writing, for me, it still comes from a creative place. And I still do creative writing even as I do academic writing too. So for example, when I sit down to write anything academic, I have to start off writing something creative first. So I have what's called sort of a brain dump file where I just get all of my ideas out, whatever's in my head that might be blocking me creatively, I just get it out. And that's not creative in terms of being fiction, but I think I kind of get my ideas out there in an artful way in that brain dump every day, and I connect what I'm thinking and writing with music. So I always have music playing in the background, and it's everything from funk, R&B, folk music, classic rock, neo soul, Afrobeat, Malagasy music, you name it. But there always has to be music infusing my writing. And then more recently, I've gotten back into writing poetry and have picked up the camera again, which I had put down for a long time. But particularly with my next research project, which focuses on cook stoves, fuels, and energy, I'm incorporating a lot of photography into that project. So I'm very excited about that.
Oh, that sounds really cool. What's the new project about?
The tentative title is Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen, Stoves, Fuels, and Women's Agency in the Global South. So in that text, I am exploring the ways that women make decisions and engage in everyday actions around cooking, fuel use, and stove use in a few countries in the Global South. So that research began in 2013. I took a trip to Ethiopia to try to understand what was going on there around the development and distribution of improved fuel-efficient cook stoves, because Ethiopia takes a very proactive stance. They have a national distribution program. They have a national program to train women in how to build stoves, how to market stoves, how to sell stoves to other women. And then I started doing further research in Vietnam and Madagascar on the same subject. But to back up for just a moment, close to half the world's population cooks every day at home with fuel sources that are called biomass. So we're talking about firewood, we're talking about charcoal, we're talking about animal dung like cow patties, we're talking about vegetable residue like the shells or hulls or husks of coconut. The way that biomass burns is it burns really inefficiently, and the smoke that's created when you burn biomass is full of small particles. They're called particulate matter. And particulate matter is very dangerous for human health because it lodges into your airway and it causes all kinds of respiratory problems, asthma, bronchitis, COPD. It causes cardiovascular problems as well, stroke, heart disease. And the thing is, it's a major source of illness and early death for women and small children around the world, because women primarily do most of the cooking, especially in the global South countries where people are using biomass. They're exposed to this smoke all the time. Their children are exposed to this smoke with them. They're often cooking in places where there's not proper ventilation. And more often than not, they're cooking over these traditional stoves that just expose them to massive volumes of smoke. So it's a perfect storm in terms of the public health exposure. And then there's also an environmental component too, because when that fuel doesn't burn efficiently, you have to use a lot of it to keep a fire going and to cook various dishes for the household. So I became really fascinated by this topic a long time ago. Again, it starts with Peace Corps. My host mother during Peace Corps cooked over an open fire every day. She would go out and collect massive bundles of firewood, carry them for miles on her head to get them back home, and then would use them every morning to start the cooking fire. And I noticed every morning as I would climb the stairs to the kitchen, the higher I got on the stairwell, the blacker the stairwell became because of that thick smoke. And the coughing, the respiratory problems, everyone in the family had chronic respiratory issues. I developed chronic respiratory issues while I was living with them. And when I was finishing up my first project and looking around for another project to do, I said, I really want to go back to that issue because it was ubiquitous in Madagascar. I noticed when I started traveling to other countries, it was ubiquitous in those countries too. And I said, I just really need to explore this further because this is fascinating. And why is this still such a challenge when so many people in the world already are not cooking this way?
How does the photography element come in? Are you taking photos of people cooking or the vessels that they're using?
I'm taking photos of people cooking, of what they're cooking with. So a lot of photos of stoves. I'm taking a lot of pictures also of the fuel sources. So I have lots of photos of bundles of firewood, piles of charcoal. I went to one factory and unexpectedly got some really good photos of large piles of just raw coal sitting around. I didn't realize that a component of a stove that I was looking at actually it was made with raw coal. I also take photos of smoke because smoke is kind of the key actor, the key player in this project because it's the smoke that goes from the biomass to the body. And it transforms from solid biomass into a semi-solid, semi-gas state, and then it enters the human body and wreaks havoc in that state. So the smoke itself is actually important, both the smoke you can see and the smoke that you can't see.
This sounds fascinating. I'm so excited to read this.
I have to say, I love this project, and I love that I'm getting back into photography through it. I think that the visual narrative is equally as important as the other narrative, and I really want to find a central way to put that out there.
So this brings me to my last and my absolute favorite question that I get to talk to folks about, and that really gets at the heart of that big why behind all of these projects. And that's that world that you're working towards, that world that you're imagining, that you're helping create, that you produce in collaboration with others. So I'll ask what is a big question, sometimes a scary question, but I think an important one. What kind of world do you want?
Wow.
I know, it's giant.
It's giant, but honestly, that's what drives everything that I do. So I'm always thinking about it, but I'm not sure that I've ever fully answered it for myself. I do want a world in which we recognize that these large-scale global environmental problems like climate change are not caused by women's decisions and actions around childbearing. I want a world in which we recognize that capitalist development, extraction, and production of resources is what's causing these large-scale environmental problems. I want a world in which we recognize that militaristic pollution of land and the atmosphere is what's causing these problems. I want us to recognize that oil production, extraction, and burning is what's causing these problems. So I really want us to think broadly in terms of scale and institutions when we identify the causes of global environmental problems. And I want us to think about that scale in terms of where we assign blame and responsibility for solving those problems too. I want a world in which poor women of color in the US and the global South are not blamed for environmental problems and are in fact in a position to really thrive and not just survive. Yeah, I think actually I'll just leave it at that. I want a world where marginalized communities don't just survive. I want us to thrive. And I want my work to be a part of that.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.